So hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. As she said, my talk is going to be on the possibility of a male birth control pill or something equivalent. I've changed the title just a little bit. So a male pill, science fiction or science versus fiction. And as that implies, I want to look at whether this is science fiction in the sense that it's beyond our current abilities, or the idea of science versus fiction, as in maybe we could do it, but we're hampered by certain false beliefs. And I just want to say before I get into the main talk, I want to give a big shout out to Dr. Lisa Campo-Engelstein. She has written a number of articles on this topic and done some really good feminist philosophy analysis. And so a lot of what I'm going to do in the talk today is going to draw pretty heavily on some really great work that she's already done. So I would like to start today with a kind of quick trip down memory lane, and I want to share some headlines you may have seen. Well, probably not you all because you're probably too young, but if you were watching this play out in the popular press. So as early as 1987, we would get press articles that would say things like, "Against all odds, chemist takes male pill to market." Or then again, by 1997, a male pill could be available in chemist shops within 3 years. Then we come to 2006, science is giving birth to a male pill. And as late as 2019, male pill is closer than ever. So we could start by asking, what is going on here? It seems like at least every 10 years, we get one of these articles that a male pill is like just around the corner, and yet it's still not here. So we immediately want to ask, what is happening? And if we take a closer look at that last article, I think we start to see a little bit about what's going on here. So the full title of that article is "A Male Pill is Closer Than Ever, So Will Women Trust Men to Take It?" And so if we look back through this history, we can see there have been a lot of research, there's been a lot of development, but research and funding for long-acting reversible contraception for men, or LARCs as we'll sometimes call them, seems to be hampered by problematic assumptions about gender and gender relations. And so that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about today. So one of the big issues here, they immediately ask is, would men use the pill and would women trust men to take it? Like, these are usually the big reasons given for either not pouring a bunch of research money into it, or if we've seen a lot of promising research studies over the course of years, but companies don't want to take it up and actually market it because they're just like, well, who knows, like, men aren't going to really want to do this, or women really going to trust them. These are the kind of arguments you see. But then we could ask, well, what kind of empirical evidence do we actually have about those kinds of questions? And we don't have a lot, obviously, since we don't actually have a male pill, but we could look at a couple things. And if you look at studies where they actually go ask men, like, would you be willing to use this were it available, we see anywhere from 44 to 85% of men claim they would consider using it. They say they would. And so we wouldn't know for sure till it happened. But then also, if we look at what's actually happening with heterosexual couples today, any heterosexual couple who's currently relying on condoms or that has agreed to participate in any of these number of studies that have happened throughout the years, these contraceptive trials, in both those cases, they are already relying primarily on men to bear the burden of contraception. So we do have at least some empirical evidence that this is possible, right, to counter what's going on there. And another question we could ask is, what are we asking when we're asking this question about trust? So in philosophy, we'll sometimes talk about what's called equivocation, or the idea that you're using a term in a couple different ways. So one of the things we could ask is, well, what exactly do you mean about trusting men? And we see that if we're asking about trusting men as a group, right, or some kind of abstract men, then people are more likely to say, well, no, I don't trust that. But if you mean trusting a specific man with whom the woman has an ongoing monogamous relationship, well, then women are much more likely to say, well, yeah, I know him, I trust him, we've been in this relationship together. So one of the first things we could push back on those questions is just sort of clarifying, well, what exactly are you asking? What do we mean by trusting men, right? And so that's one of the reasons we see this disconnect between people arguing that men wouldn't take it, we wouldn't trust them. So this is one way to think about that question. And then another way to think about this is what's kind of behind, even if we're thinking about men as a group, right? Or this sort of abstract men, and we say, well, no, we don't really trust them to be responsible for birth control. We can ask, well, why? What's going on behind that? And so Dr. Campo-Engelstein argues that we as a culture, women as a group, however you want to play that out, tend to say they don't trust men as a group because of sort of three general stereotypes about men. She thinks that's what's kind of behind that distrust. And the three are this idea of an uncontrollable libido, that men are domestically incompetent, and that men are not as committed to preventing pregnancy. So we're going to briefly just look at each of those and see how they relate to this topic. So on the first question of an uncontrollable libido, I think this is probably the easiest stereotype for us to understand, right? We're consistently told that men need sex in a way that women do not. Again, you guys are probably a little young for some of this, but you know, like we have all kinds of comedies. Well, no, we still have those comedies today. What am I saying? Like teen comedies based on the lengths men will go to for sexual satisfaction. You get these theories, you know, evolutionary psychology, biology kind of theories about how men need to spread their seed. Also, more recently, we get books about hookup culture, right? And the idea that, you know, masculinity is still kind of tied to a sexual prowess. Then also, we continue to see this perpetuated in the idea of abstinence-only education, which is still, for better or worse, very common in the United States. So, for example, here's a quote from an abstinence-only education text called Sex Respect, the Option of True Sexual Freedom, because they generally become less aroused or become aroused less easily. Girls are in a good position to slow down the young man and help him learn balance in the relationship. The girl may be showing her interest in the guy, but the guy may sometimes misread this behavior and get carried away by his physical reactions to that behavior, right? So again, we see this idea that women have more control over their sexuality. They don't have this uncontrollable over their, and we also, as a women's studies group, could probably interrogate some other things going on in that quote, but for the moment, we'll stay focused on the contraception issue. So the idea behind this stereotype is that men just don't have enough physical restraint to be responsible for birth control or contraception. And so again, we could first of all, of course, push back against the stereotype, but even if we believed this stereotype, it seems a bit illogical in relation to long-acting reversible contraceptives, because generally, I mean, all the ones I can think of for women, they don't have to, you don't have to use them in the heat of the moment, like when you're actually having intercourse, right? It's usually, you know, a birth control pill you take at breakfast in the morning, or injectables, or if we think about something like Norplant, it's unclear, like, so the stereotype even further seems to be disconnected from the issue at hand. Whoops, skipped ahead. So then the second one, if we think about this idea of men being domestically incompetent, this one, I do think we're starting to see a sort of generational thing. I mean, I can remember back in the 80s, not only do we have all of these crazy movies like Mr. Mom and Daddy Daycare, because, you know, it's so funny, all these poor men now have to take care of a kid, but we would actually get like all these commercials. I can remember, you know, like suddenly men can't even figure out how to work a toaster or a microwave. And to be honest, I don't think we have as much of that going on today as we used to. In that sense, this stereotype is definitely changing. However, we do still sometimes see a certain amount of stigma attached to men when they are competent at household chores or take on these nurturing capabilities. So like this article from 2018 is still talking about like how stay-at-home dads still struggle with diapers, drool, stigma, and isolation. And that article isn't talking so much about men being incompetent. I mean, they do hint that sometimes they're kind of a little overwhelmed, but really more so that, you know, the stigma, they're seen as, you know, a little off, right? Like people are still suspicious, if you will. And so I think that one's shifted a little. So while I think these stereotypes are changing, they still haunt us in that way. and especially for any man who's forced to stay home with kids or chooses to. And so if we think about that in relation to the question of long-acting reversible contraceptives, so if the big part of the stereotype of the domestically incompetent, the idea was, well, if a man can't even work a microwave, then how are we going to trust him to take care of contraception, right? Like, we can't possibly be responsible for that. And so if we're saying that one's changing, clearly, like, I think it is, now we might say there might still be a kind of stigma with it, right? Like that men aren't supposed to take care of it or something. Like that's something they need to be beyond. And we can talk a little bit more about that when we get to some of the later parts. And again, we can also talk about how much we think these kind of stereotypes still hold or do not hold as we get to it. And then the last one she points to hiding behind this distrust is this idea that men are not as interested in preventing pregnancy. So it's believed that men are not as invested in preventing pregnancy for at least a couple reasons. One being they don't have to endure the physical burdens, right? So if a pregnancy happens, whether you carry that pregnancy to term or choose to get an abortion, it's the woman's body who's always going to have to bear those physical burdens. And so it's argued that men don't care as much from that sense. And then there's also the argument that, like sex, there's this aspect of virility tied to masculinity, right? Being able to father children is a prized norm. And we see that, I mean, you can see I have the Duggars up there and their mini brood, right? But then we also see it in the reverse, right? Some men who don't want to get vasectomies will talk about not wanting to be neutered, or you'll see people talk about the idea of some guy shooting blanks if he's having fertility issues. And so there's that also kind of stigma. So between the two of those, the idea that men are not as interested in preventing pregnancy. So again, the idea that they wouldn't be as responsible with contraception. So those are the stereotypes that she identifies behind this idea of why we might not necessarily trust men as a group. We've talked a little bit about why those do or don't fit, how relevant we think they still are. I want to switch now then and go back to the idea of, well, then, so we're pushing back against the stereotypes behind why we don't trust men. Now I want to revisit also then the idea of what empirical evidence, what's actually happening, right? So there was a World Health Organization trial in the United Kingdom in the early 1990s, where they actually had a trial for a long-acting reversible contraceptive in men. So according to the article, men received weekly androgen injections to reduce sperm counts to below 3 million sperm per milliliter semen. On average, it required about 3 to 4 months for the men to become sufficiently subfertile, but then after which time the couple then relied exclusively for up to a year on the weekly hormone injections as their only form of contraception. The prototype hormone successfully established the fact that subfertility in men could be achieved and fertility fully restored when the hormone was withdrawn. So by all accounts, this was a really successful trial. And the article I'm going to pull some quotes from here, they went through and did a kind of qualitative analysis. They interviewed the couples that were involved in the trial and asked them about some of these different topics and stereotypes that come up. So on the first one, this idea of trusting men, we see exactly the kind of disconnect we were seeing on that other screen, right? The reason some women may not approve of involving men in family planning is because of a lack of trust. In a trusting relationship, either partner can be counted on to use contraception when will it become available, right? So there's no problem trusting the specific partner. It's just the sort of amorphous group that they're pushing back on. And then on signing up for the trial, right? The idea of whether or not men would want to do it or men would be on board with it. Again, here was a woman from the trial. I saw it in the newspaper and thought, that sounds good. It's about time men took some responsibility for contraception after years of battling. So I handed the paper over to him and he said immediately, yes, let's go for it, right? So again, we're not necessarily seeing the pushback. Not that there wouldn't be pushback from anybody, right? But clearly there is some interest and there's a significant group that would be on board. And then finally, at the end of the trial, because after this year or so when the trial was over, they had to leave and go back to whatever options they currently had. We have to be honest, I'm quite sad that it is over. I'm sorry, your little screens are over my quote there. I was fine with it or something like that, as was my wife. I asked the doctor if I had to leave. If I had a choice, I would have continued it. And so some of the couples in this trial were actually really upset when the trial ended. It worked fabulous for them. They really enjoyed the experience and were really very sad that they had to go back to the limited options they had before. So as we wrap up this very brief talk, I want to think a little bit about flipping the script. So obviously we can think about the stereotypes we talked about before, but I want to say related to that, there are at least 3 reasons that we should think about strongly supporting creating a LARC for men. And the first one, building on the study we're just talking about, it creates more options for heterosexual couples that don't have any other good options. So a lot of the couples in that trial in the early 90s, part of why they were so excited to join the trial is the women in the couples had really terrible side effects from using hormonal contraceptives or the pill, right? Some of them would get terrible migraines, some of the women would get depressed, and the husbands wanted to be helpful, but they just really didn't have any other options, right? Most of the couples were not very excited about having to rely only on condoms. A lot of them, right, weren't sure they were done having children, and so vasectomy wasn't a good option. And so they were thrilled to have this other option, and it worked really well for a lot of the couples. So that would be one reason. And then another reason, building on that, is to just in general increase men's autonomy. Now, I know greater choice does not always one-to-one mean greater autonomy, but I think in this case it could, because this option is so different than the sort of limited options that men are currently have. And I mean, we know also that a lot of couples will use multiple forms. Like even if they're using condoms, the woman will still take the pills. So this can also add extra layers for people who want those kinds of backup options. And then finally, just to broaden our conceptions of masculinity. And part of that would be pushing back against some of the stereotypes we talked earlier, but it also could mean just the general idea that contraception has to be a woman's issue, right? Or that women always have to bear the responsibility for that. And sort of instead then thinking about this as an issue for couples and broadening our idea of masculinity in that sense. So I'm going to leave us with one final quote. This is also from that same study from the early 90s. I suppose in a sense it would actually empower men. Let's see if I can get this. Yeah. Men would be in the power to actually control their own contraception. I think there would be a very large group of men who would be very keen to do so. And so that was obviously in the 1990s. I can only imagine, or at least hope, that that sentiment was probably even stronger today, right? So I'll leave up here as we're recording this. People could go back if they want to. Here's my works cited. If you want to go look at any of those actual articles, read a little bit more about what my colleague Campbell Engelstein has written about this, or even reading that whole qualitative analysis of the study is really fascinating, some of the quotes and what people had in there. And then I will also leave us with this resource if anyone needs it or is interested. Otherwise, that's the end of my talk. I'm happy to try to answer questions, or if we want to have just any kind of conversation about it. Yeah.
So thank you very much. That was really interesting. I loved the Duggar picture that you put in there. That seemed like to be the perfect picture. So I have a question. So when you were talking about, the women actually liking that their partners were using some form of contraception, my first thought was, well, yes, because a lot of women do struggle with hormonal birth control, or they might have some conditions that could be exacerbated by the fluctuation in hormones. So the injections that the men got weren't hormone-based. They were more of a suppressant of some other sort. And is there anything that is hormone-based for men? And is anyone anywhere have a pill on the market for men? Like, is the notion of a pill, are we close? I mean, despite all the articles for the last 30 years, are we almost there?
So a few questions in there. I do think some of them can be hormonal, and they did talk in that study. I mean, it was the case that some of the men had side effects too, right? They talked about some of them got acne, or it, you know, they had sort of emotional changes. And so I think, like women, it would sort of depend, right? Like some people can tolerate it better than others. To my knowledge, we do not have anything on the market right now that is a long-acting contraceptive for men. As I understand it, the biggest research hurdle, as far as what I've seen, is delivery systems. So like these men were going in every week to get an injection. And I would think that's pretty cumbersome, that a lot of people would really push back about that. So I think getting the proper balance of hormones or whatever it is they're using, and then finding a delivery method that's not too cumbersome seems to be the biggest hurdles, aside from these kind of stereotypes we've got right now. Yeah.
Sure. Okay, that makes sense. If anyone has a question that they want to ask while we're still recording, now is your time. I'll pause for a minute and let anyone do that if they'd like. And if not, then I'm going to stop the recording so that folks can ask questions more discreetly. So.
Yeah, so I have a question about the first study you referenced, where it said about 44 to 85% of men are noted interest in that study.
Right.
Were there any breakdowns on the demographics of those men, like how many were in relationships or how many were single, stuff like that?
Oh, that's an excellent question. And unfortunately, I do not have an excellent answer. I pulled that from another article. So I did not actually see the original study to know how that was broke down or not broke down.
Okay, interesting. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone else for a question on record? Okay, so I'm going to stop the recording here.